And on to the 5th chapter, River Creatures. When my father did not need Tank to till the rice fields during the rainy season, I liked to ride on his back and look for an otter's party. There were many otters living on the riverbanks in front of our hamlet because fish were plentiful in the deep river. Normally the otters lived in twos, but once in a while they all gathered together, caught a great number of fish, and threw them up on the riverbank. Then they all sat down around the fish and ate them. We called this unusual gathering an otter's party. One day my cousin and I thought up a plan to capture the otter's fish. It would be hard to do because if the otters saw people approaching to try and take their fish, they jumped back into the river and took all the fish with them. But otters did not worry about other animals, so I decided that because Tank's back was wide and high above the ground, I could lie flat on his back and approach an otter's party without attracting their attention. To make detection of me even more difficult, I would wear clothes that blended in as much as possible with the color of Tank's back. I would also carry a sturdy stick to scare the otters away in case they turned on me. I had to take this last precaution because I knew that otters, when gathered in a large group, had attacked people who passed by them in small boats. A few days later, I spotted an otter's party on the riverbank. I found a good stick and climbed onto Tank's back. After I showed Tank the direction I wanted him to go, I lay face down and let him carry me to the party. When Tank was about 3 meters from the group, I slid down to the ground and chased all the otters into the river. That day I caught them thoroughly by surprise, and I got 24 fish, all different kinds, and most of them still intact and fresh. After that, I repeated my raids as often as I could, and usually with great success. But one day, after I had surprised the otters and put all the fish on Tank's back, I noticed that one female did not leave. She just swam up and down the river and seemed very anxious to return to where I was. Sensing something unusual, I carefully looked around and discovered 3 otter cubs in a very deep, narrow hole under a thick thistle bush. I was very excited. Otter cubs were priceless, for one could train an otter cub to catch as many fish as one wanted. When I had squeezed myself into the hole and had almost reached the cubs, the mother otter came up behind me and bit my toes very hard. It was so painful that I had to crawl out of the hole as quickly as possible and shake her off. The mother otter jumped back into the river, but when I crawled into the hole again, I received the same painful bite on my toes. Suddenly, I came up with an idea. I took some mud from the riverbank and wrote on Tank's back, "Otter cubs, come quickly." Then I gave Tank a little tap on the back and said, "Go." Tank trotted straight home. When Tank arrived home, my parents saw the fish he carried, but no me. They panicked. Then they discovered the message on Tank's back, and they were very happy. My cousin and Tank soon returned to where I was. My cousin prevented the mother otter from biting me while I took the 3 cubs out of the hole one by one. We sold 2 of the cubs at the marketplace to 2 rich merchants and kept the 3rd one to train to catch fish for us. The cub we kept quickly learned its job, but we always kept it in an iron cage for fear that it would run away from us. Unfortunately, when I caught the cub, its eyes had already opened. If it had just been born and its eyes had not yet opened, we would have been the first beings it saw, and it would have considered us its parents and remained with us for the rest of its life. Afterward, whenever we wanted fish, we just brought our otter to the riverbank, tied it to a long rope to prevent it from escaping, and let it dive into the river. When it caught a fish, it surfaced and gave the fish to us. Since it was always easy for us to get fish, we gave them to friends whenever they wanted any. Sometimes when we had free days, we let our otter fish all day long. It caught a great number of fish, which we then dried and sent to our relatives, who weren't as lucky as we to have a trained otter for a fisherman. In the river in front of our hamlet, there lived a type of catfish that weighed more than 100 kilos when fully grown. Gourmets sought them, but they were difficult to catch because they often broke the fish line or tore up the fish net. We called them white catfish in order to distinguish them from black catfish, which were darker and smaller. To catch white catfish, we used a squirrel, or a big frog as bait. We couldn't use fishing poles made of light bamboo trees because they would break, and big, heavy poles were too tiring to hold. Thus, a fisherman who wanted to catch a white catfish just held the fish line firmly in his hands. When the catfish bit, the fisherman held the line for a while. If the line did not break and the catfish tired, he slowly pulled it into the riverbank and used a big net to pull it onto dry ground. One day, I left Tank and the other buffaloes grazing near the river while I talked with a friend of my family's. He was old and could not do hard work in the field, so he fished for white catfish to help out his family. I had just finished saying that if a fish took the bait, I would help him, when I saw his face turn pink and his hands shake very hard. Immediately, I jumped next to him, grabbed the line, and started pulling. The fish fought back like a devil, and one of its powerful jerks almost dragged both of us into the river. I yelled to Tank to come and help us. Tank came quickly. We tied the fish line to his horns and signaled him to walk backward. Tank lowered his head and pulled with all his strength. Luckily, the line held, and Tank dragged the fish closer and closer to shore. Suddenly, we saw a huge white catfish jump into the air and then fall back into the water with a tremendous splash. Tank kept pulling, and the old man kept yelling, "That's right, son! That's right, son!" Moments later, we saw the head of the fish come out of the water, then the body, and finally the tail. When the entire fish was on the riverbank, we stopped Tank and untied the line from his horns. Our old friend was so happy that he jumped up and down like a child. He said that without me and Tank, he knew that the catfish would have gotten away from him. Then we brought Tank closer to the fish so that he could see it clearly. Tank looked at the fish and pricked up his ears in a funny way. My old friend called it a day because he had made a big catch and he wanted to go home immediately to show his family. But the fish was too heavy for him to carry. Although it was still early, I decided to bring the herd home so that Tank could help our friend carry the fish. I told our friend that we should load the fish on Tank's back. He was very happy with the idea, but said that first he had to cut off the fish's pectoral fins. He explained to me that each pectoral fin has a spine with venom in it that made a cut from the fin very painful. He took a knife out of his pocket, cut off the 2 pectoral fins, and thereby prevented Tank from being hurt. When we arrived at my house, where I left the herd, the old friend wanted to give my parents part of the fish, but my parents refused his offer, telling him that our otter caught all the fish we needed. They said he should keep the whole fish and sell it at the marketplace, where he would get a good price for such a delicacy. Tank and I accompanied our friend to his house. When we arrived, his family was very happy to see the big fish. The old man kept repeating how wildly the fish had fought and how helpful Tank and I had been. Soon all his children got busy. Several carried the fish inside. One prepared tea for him, and another hung his fishing line on the wall. When the boys and girls were tired of looking at the fish, they surrounded Tank and asked me endless questions about him. Why was Tank's stomach so big? Was he pregnant? Why were the hairs at the end of his tail longer than those on his head? And so on. My friend's wife wanted me to stay for dinner, but I refused because my parents had told me to be back as soon as possible. My mother wanted to use Tank to draw some water from the well. But as I said goodbye, my friend's wife made sure I didn't refuse a piece of cake to eat on the way home and a lump of brown sugar for Tank. Tank was very fond of brown sugar, more than he was of fishing, I think. And then here's a picture. The otter has a fish, and Tank has the catfish on his back. Pretty awesome. From the time Tank helped our old friend to get the white catfish, I had considered the idea of catching golden eels with Tank's help. There were 2 kinds of golden eels living in our area. One kind had bulging eyes, the other had beady eyes. Both were very much sought after because their meat was excellent. These eels, when matured, reached 2 meters in length and weighed about 5 kilos. The eels lived in muddy ditches that brought water to the fruit gardens, the banana groves, and the coconut groves when the level of the water in the river in front of our hamlet was high. They hid in deep holes that they dug in the hard clay soil beneath the mud of the ditch, usually near a tree planted on the border of the ditch. The roots of the tree were a natural barrier against intruders, and when an eel coiled its body around the root of a tree, it was almost impossible to pull it out. Each eel's nest had several openings to allow it to escape in case of danger, and inside a nest there were many zigzag corners, which allowed an eel to hook its body around a corner and resist someone's trying to pull it out by its head or tail. Eels lay constantly in ambush near the main entrance of their nest, waiting for prey to pass by. Fish, shrimp, crabs, even baby ducks if a mother duck was foolish enough to lead her young brood over an eel's nest. Then the eel would shoot out of its nest like an arrow, snap up a baby duck, pull it down into its nest, and swallow it moments later. Sometimes an eel even tried to attack an adult duck if food was scarce. It would bite the duck's foot and tried to pull the frightened fowl down into the nest, where it would drown. The duck might survive if someone heard it quack and rushed to rescue it, but it would often lose one foot because the teeth of a golden eel are very sharp. One could lure an eel with almost any kind of bait, but we used earthworms because they were easy to find. We would dangle the worm at the nest's entrance, and sooner or later the eel would come out and bite the bait. We allowed the eel to swallow the bait far down into its stomach instead of pulling the line right away, for if we pulled the line too soon, we would only succeed in tearing off the eel's jaw during the struggle to pull it out of its nest. But with a hook in its stomach, it could not get away no matter how hard it tried. Sooner or later, unless the fishing line broke, we would drag the eel out of its nest, dead or alive. In our hamlet, whenever an eel was hooked, the children of the neighborhood had a good time. They ran out of their houses when they heard the yell for help. 2 or 3 boys would help pull out the eel, and everyone else yelled or laughed. Sometimes adults came to help too, if they were not busy. It took at least 1 hour to pull the eel out of its nest, and by this time it was usually dead. But a live eel got a better price than a dead one at the market, and since Tank had easily succeeded in pulling the white catfish out of the river for our old friend, I came up with the idea of letting him drag eels out of their nests for me. If he could pull an eel out quickly, I had a better chance to get the eel alive instead of dead. First, I had to find an eel's nest, but this was not difficult. One can know roughly the location of a nest by listening carefully to the sound an eel makes when it snaps at a victim. The sound made by its closing jaws is similar to that of a loud click and can be heard clearly from 30 or 40 meters away, especially at night. After finding the general area of a nest, I pinpointed the exact location by examining the mud. The mud around the main entrance of the nest is always more disturbed than the rest. Then I tied the end of a fishing line to Tank's horns and made the bait jump up and down on the mud covering the hole. The eel stuck its head out of the mud first, saw the bait clearly, snapped it up, and returned to its nest below. I loosened the line to let the eel swallow the bait into its stomach. Then I signaled Tank to pull. Despite his tremendous strength, Tank needed quite a bit of effort to pull the eel out of its nest, but it was the most exciting sight to see the wagging head of the eel stick out of the mud first, and then its big, trembling golden body come slowly out of the hole. When the eel was on dry ground, it yanked, turned, and squirmed like an earthworm attacked by a swarm of fire ants. Using this method, I caught several big eels. None of them could resist Tank more than 50 counts. When Tank started pulling, I counted 1, 2, 3. Some strong eels reached 45, but the weaker ones were already on dry ground, wriggling, when I had not yet reached 20. Often when an eel had taken the bait, I yelled to my friends to come to see Tank's work. When everybody arrived, I signaled Tank to pull. Some of my friends counted with me while the others yelled, clapped their hands, or cheered loudly for Tank. It was difficult to tell whether Tank enjoyed fishing for eels as much as we did, but he always accomplished his task extremely well. And if you noticed in the last picture, when we were looking at the catfish on Tank's back, here's also Tank pulling the eel out of a nest.